On August 1st, 1834, the day Britain's slaves were to become free, nothing happened. The Slavery Abolition Act had received royal assent 11 months earlier, on August 28, 1833, and across the British Caribbean men and women had counted down the days to a sunrise that was supposed to change everything. Instead, that morning passed like any other. In London, a parliamentary deadlock had quietly suspended the timetable. For decades afterward, historians would argue over how a measure already signed into law could simply fail to take effect. And the answer lay not in principle, but in arithmetic. Earl Grey, who had carried the Great Reform Act of 1832, resigned in July 1834, and Lord Melbourne inherited a Whig ministry with a majority too thin to govern comfortably. Into that weakness stepped the West India interest, the organized bloc of absentee planters, merchants and city creditors who held seats in Parliament and leverage in the financial houses of London. They did not attack abolition directly. They simply withheld their votes on unrelated finance bills until the government agreed to renegotiate the Emancipation schedule. The price of their cooperation was a 5-year postponement and a compensation settlement larger than the £20 million already promised. Melbourne, needing to hold his ministry together, paid it. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently, because what was traded away that summer would not surface in full for 2 generations. Thomas Fowell Buxton had taken up the abolitionist banner after William Wilberforce, who died on July 29, 1833, days after learning the bill would pass. Buxton now faced a problem Wilberforce never had. A movement can be sustained by a coming victory. It cannot easily be sustained by a victory that has been indefinitely deferred. The Anti-Slavery Society, the Militant Agency Committee, and the vast network of provincial societies relaunched their petitioning campaign through the autumn of 1834. Nonconformist congregations and the women's anti-slavery associations gathered signatures as they had before. But the energy was different. The apprenticeship system, the awkward compromise that was meant to bind former slaves to their owners through a transitional period, never began, because there was no emancipation for it to follow. Without a date, the campaign had no horizon. Subscriptions thinned. Provincial committees met less often. The argument did not die, but it lost its urgency, and in politics urgency is everything. Buxton wrote privately that he feared the cause had been not defeated but adjourned, and that an adjourned cause is the easiest kind to forget. The consequences of the postponement reached far beyond Westminster. To understand them, we have to follow the ships. Britain had abolished its own transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic to suppress the traffic under treaties Britain had pressed on other powers. That diplomacy rested on moral authority, on Britain's ability to say it had cleansed its own house. With emancipation stalled and the suspension renewed past its first 5 years, that authority eroded. Foreign governments grew less willing to honor inspection treaties, and British ministers grew less willing to spend political capital enforcing them. The result was visible in the harbors of the Atlantic world. Slave imports into Brazil, governed during the regency for the young Pedro II, climbed sharply through the late 1830s. Spanish Cuba absorbed rising numbers as well. The sugar and coffee frontiers of both economies were expanding, hungry for labor, and the patrol that had once raised the cost, and the risk of the trade now intercepted a smaller share of it. Slavery in the Atlantic was not retreating, it was being resupplied. Across the ocean, American slaveholders had been watching Britain closely. The nullification crisis had been settled in 1833. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 still haunted the plantation South, and William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator had begun the same year to demand immediate emancipation. To many Southern planters, British abolition had loomed as a warning, proof that a great power might one day decide their world was indefensible. Now the warning inverted. Britain, the wealthiest empire on earth, had passed emancipation and then quietly shelved it. Southern editors and politicians read that outcome as vindication. If London could not free its colonies, the argument ran, then slavery was not a doomed institution, but a durable one, sustained by interests too powerful and too rational to surrender. That confidence hardened Southern politics precisely as the annexation of Texas entered national debate. A class that might have argued defensively now argued from strength. Britain did not abandon emancipation forever, but what finally arrived bore little resemblance to the Clean Act of 1834. Colonial emancipation came in stages, spread across years, each stage negotiated against fresh compensation for owners and fresh guarantees of continued labor. The total paid out swelled well beyond the original settlement. The enslaved population of the Caribbean was freed not by a single sunrise, but by a long, contested, partial process that left planters enriched and freed people bound by labor codes for years after their nominal liberation. It was emancipation by installments, and a precedent delivered in installments is a weak precedent. The decisive British example that had once frightened slaveholders everywhere never materialized. And then came the development that would shape the rest of the century. In the timeline we know, British emancipation gave American abolitionists a moral anchor and gave the South a vivid fear. Here, neither pressure operated with the same force. The result was an American politics in which the sectional balance held longer than it ever should have. Cotton, sugar, and coffee economies were thriving across the hemisphere, and slavery looked less like an anomaly and more like a permanent feature of the Atlantic order. American sectional crises still came, over Texas, over the Western Territories, over the admission of new states, but each was managed through compromise rather than rupture. The compromises were not wise. They were merely possible because the moral and economic ground that might have made compromise impossible had not yet shifted. Each settlement bought time, and each one allowed the institution it postponed a conflict over to grow. Time, in this timeline, worked for slavery. With every decade of managed compromise, the institution in the American South grew more entrenched. It spread into new territories. It acquired stronger legal scaffolding in the courts and stronger financial scaffolding in the banks and insurers that lent against enslaved people as property. Railroads extended its reach. The enslaved population grew larger than it had ever been in the timeline we know. Most consequentially, a full generation came of age, having never seen slavery seriously challenged by a great power. To them, it was not a controversy. It was simply the architecture of the world. The voices that had once imagined a peaceful end to it grew old, and fewer voices rose to replace them. The reckoning still came. It always does. But it came in the 1880s, not the 1860s, and it came into a country far harder than the one Lincoln's generation had known. When sectional conflict finally erupted into civil war, it did so with a larger enslaved population than ever before, with deeper capital sunk into human property, and with a Southern society that had spent 50 additional years convincing itself that its order was permanent and just. The middle ground had eroded. The men who might have brokered a peaceful settlement had not been born into a world that produced such men. The war was longer, the destruction greater, and the peace that followed more bitter, because the thing being uprooted had been allowed 5 extra decades to grow its roots. History did not change course on August 1st, 1834. That was the point. A law already passed simply waited, and waiting proved more powerful than any vote against it. The real abolition of 1834 was imperfect, compromised, and cruel in its apprenticeship clauses. But it happened, and its happening sent a signal across an ocean and down through years. Delay is rarely dramatic. It announces nothing, breaks no news, fills no square with crowds. It only changes what is possible later. And in this timeline, a single deferred sunrise was enough to bend the 19th century toward a longer night.